Hello and welcome back to the Views Expressed, public affairs programming on WACA-TV here in Ashland. On our continuing series on Governor's Council candidates, we have Mr. Sean Murphy joining us. Welcome, Mr. Murphy.
Hi, Makita. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for being here. So I think we're just going to dive right into it. But first, before we start talking about Governor's Council, we'd like to find out a little bit more about you. Who is Sean Murphy?
Well, I'm the son of immigrants. Both my parents are Irish immigrants. We actually moved back to Ireland when I was a child, so I spent some time, part of my childhood, living in Ireland for about 3 years. Ireland at that time was a fairly poor country, and there wasn't a whole lot of work. So my father was actually in the United States working and sending money back. We lasted about 3 years before my mother said, you know, well, we can't sustain this. We came back to America. I mostly grew up in Braintree. I lived in Dorchester, but mostly I grew up in Braintree. I graduated from Braintree in 1995. I joined the U.S. Navy. I did 4 years in the service. I was deployed on 2 different ships, the USS Merrill, the USS Fitzgerald. On my second deployment, I took part in what's called Operation Desert Fox. Was on a VBSS team, which is a visit, board, search, and seizure team. And our job was to board ships coming out of Iraq at that time. This is during the Clinton administration. And after I got out of the Navy, I returned back to Boston, worked for my father. It was a union shop, ATS equipment in Dorchester. As time went on, I went back to California. My wife's from California. I was working there as electrician, as a union electrician, and you know, we had the crash, the real estate crash, and I got laid off, which was tough because I got laid off when we were expecting our first child, and this is before we had unified healthcare. President Obama had just come into office, and there was no healthcare, but I was very lucky because I was in the union, and the healthcare was covering my son's birth and everything afterwards, and I was taken care of, and the union really did take care of me. But I sat down with my wife. I said, look, you know, I love construction, but we've got to do something better. So I went back to school at night, got my bachelor's degree, and then continued on and went to law school at night. And my second child was born while I was in law school, which, you know, probably is why she'll be the next attorney in the family, because she's the one who's geared for it. And then after I graduated, I passed the bar in Massachusetts. I came back. We moved to Brockton. We had our third child, my youngest, and I started working as an attorney. I've been in practice for about 10 years. I'm a former city solicitor in Brockton. I do a lot of volunteer work. In our practice, myself and my partner sat down and we decided that we were going to do an awful lot of a fair amount of our business was going to be to serve indigent veterans. Of all the groups out there right now, veterans are the most underserved because veterans don't ask for help. So whenever we have a lot of the veterans agents will send us cases, and we'll take those pro bono if they don't have any money. So that's kind of our practice. We built it. We do make money. We have private cases because we have to pay bills, but a good portion of our stuff is volunteer.
Well, Mr. Murphy, thank you for that overview, and we'll talk a little bit more about specifically why some of those qualifications or why some of those activities may qualify you for Governor's Council District 2. But I should probably ask you why you're running for Governor's Council. And I will say this before you answer that question: there may be some of our viewers who don't know what Governor's Council is. It's just one of those boxes that they circle when they go to the polls, but it's actually provides a key function. So if you could tell folks a little bit about what Governor's Council is and then why you're running for the position.
Well, Governor's Council does an array of things, but the one thing that is the most important is they confirm judges. So when the governor wants to appoint somebody to the judiciary, it has to go through the Governor's Council. It was basically the very first checks and balances we had in this country. We wanted to make sure that the governor didn't have just carte blanche and put whoever he or she wants in office. And I think the Governor's Council is very important because as a litigator, I'm in court all the time. I've been before some good judges and not so good judges, and I want to ensure we have good judges going forward. I think maybe your viewers don't realize that there's a mandatory retirement age, and a lot of judges are leaving the bench, and there's a lot of vacancies. And we're not filling them very quickly, for whatever reason, but we really need to ensure that the people go in there are qualified and they are a very good fit for the bar. And
So a couple follow-ups to that. So what do you know offhand what that mandatory retirement age is for judges in the Commonwealth at this point is?
I believe it's 70.
70?
70, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
And oh, no worries. And I'm also very curious. You said, governor's council acts as a check or balance against what the governor may want to, who the governor may want to appoint for judges. And you talked about, being able to discern between good judges and bad judges. Um, how do you define what makes a good judge as opposed to a poor judge?
Well, what I would say is this: a good candidate to become a judge, there's some factors that I would consider. One, have they been in practice? And I don't just mean someone who's done transactional work. Someone who's done 1,000 closings hasn't been in the courtroom very often. So I would love to see more litigators who are in the courtroom, because the learning curve won't be as bad. There's rules of evidence, there's dealing with attorneys, there's how the courtroom works. They're already used to dealing with this. So a litigation background is important to me. It's not an absolute. I mean, we can have judges that don't have a litigation background. Judge Young was a great judge who just retired from the federal court, but he didn't really have a litigation background, but he became a very good judge. So the other factors I would say is we want our judges to be even keeled. Look, I'm a Democrat. I have a democratic values, but I don't want the judiciary to be over politicized. Because if you think about it, the judges are the great referees between the left and the right and the middle. So when no one can get along, you really need a judge that can see from both sides and make the right decision based on the facts in front of them. Everybody has a bias. You're not going to get around that. But a good judge can take his or her bias, put it in their back pocket, and focus on the law and the facts, regardless who's in front of them.
What would be some of the things that you would see as a warning flag as for someone who would be nominated as a judge, and something that characteristics that would make you take pause if you were on governor's council?
Well, first thing I would do is I would be calling my colleagues and everybody I could think of to find out, have you had a case with this person? What's their demeanor? How will they deal with? There's some lawyers that are very tough to deal with. Doesn't mean they won't be good judges, but I would much rather have the judges to understand, and we're more apt to, like, look, we're going to settle, we're going to work together to come to a resolution, than the attorneys that maybe want to just run up billable hours for their own sake. I know that, I'd like to say that's the minority, but there are attorneys out there that do that. I don't want someone who is just argumentative all the time, because that's not what a judge is. A judge has to be a great listener. A judge has to make some tough decisions, but he has to make both sides feel like they've been heard.
So that's interesting. And I think that there are some folks who would definitely agree with you on some of those characteristics, but I think there may be some questions out there. And I've done a couple of these interviews with other candidates at this point, and I've been reading the paper. And every time there seems to be a seat up for governor's council, we always have a question about if the governor's council in the Commonwealth should even exist. Some folks say that it's outlived its utility. I'd love to get your opinion about that. I know you're running for the office, but we've had a lot of interesting opinions on that. What are your thoughts on some of those concerns that folks have vocalized about the body?
So I've heard those concerns, but here's the alternative: is to have judges elected, right? Then judges become politicians. I know I'm running for office. I'm not your normal politician. It's the first time I'm running for office. But unfortunately, politicians, they have to be swayed one way or the other, whatever the climate is at that time. And we really want our judges to be appointed and based on qualifications and their ability to be unbiased. If they have to run for office every couple of years, that I think that's going to hurt their being unbiased, and it's going to have decisions that are going to be more like, oh, I gotta make sure I have these people are happy with me, or those people are happy with me, or this group endorses me. Like, you really can't have that to have good judiciaries. I think that the places, and I lived in a state that did elect judges, and I thought it was a bad system. I think this system is a much better system because, one, look, the governor is going to get a shot at appointing whoever she wants. The governor's council is going to make sure that they're qualified and a good fit. And the governor's council is beholden to the voters. So the voters will have their say, but not continually influence the judiciary when the judiciary is there to basically play referee.
So I've heard that argument before. And one thing that I've heard about governor's council, yes, the governor's council is accountable to voters, but still people insist that governor's council usually acts as a rubber stamp for whatever the governor wants, particularly if the governor's council members happen to be of the same party. Um, that's something that we've all heard. What I'd like to find out from you is what steps would you take to ensure that that wouldn't be the case if you were elected?
First, I would say that I don't necessarily think that the governor's council is a rubber stamp. I mean, if you go back, there's been times that they've said no and they voted against people. What will happen, though, is most governors will probe and find out, well, how do they feel about this candidate ahead of time? Because they don't want to put someone forward that is a no. Same with clemency. Like, I think Governor Baker wanted to put someone up for a pardon just before he left office, and he got the word back from the governor's council, it's a no-go, and he didn't even try to put it up. So I understand that people see that the final vote is unanimous a lot of times, but there's a lot of work that's been done beforehand. And like, I know some of the people on the council, like Terry Kennedy's been on the council longer than everybody. I don't know anybody who works harder than Terry. It's not like I would definitely say he's not a rubber stamp. As far as myself, I'm going to take the time to make sure I understand each applicant's background. I'm going to take time to meet them. I'm going to do my research, and whatever time it takes, it takes. But I won't be a rubber stamp. But again, like I said, I want to defend the council a little bit. I don't think they're a rubber stamp. I think that the public is not exactly seeing what's going on all the time.
Well, that's important for the public to understand. So shifting more back to you a little bit, I'd like to find out why you're running for governor's council, specifically in the policy area. Folks run for governor's council because they care about specific issues or they care about how the governor's council is run. If you could share maybe your top two or even more issues that you're concerned about in running for this office, I think the viewers would be very interested in hearing that.
Well, the biggest reason I'm running for this office is I don't want just some politically connected person getting on the bench that's not suited for it. And I don't want to point anybody out. I'm an attorney. I don't, but there have been some good judges and some not so good judges. And some of the judges that came in, there's been great ones that have been appointed recently, but there's some that, have had a tough time with the learning curve, and I think maybe on a good fit for the bench. I'm truly running to make sure that we have unbiased, fair judges. I think that's the most important thing. This is a very narrow position, right? I'm not running for a legislative position. I'm a pro-union guy. I can tell you about all my beliefs, but when it comes down to this position, what's important is we have unbiased judges.
Right. So the unbiased judge piece is primarily the issue that you're concerned about with governor's council. Are there one thing I wanted to circle back on where how do you ensure that a judge is unbiased? I mean, you said earlier yourself that everybody has biases. So I'm just curious if this is, I mean, this is something you are very concerned about. How are you going to discern that? How can you tell if someone, or as you're going through a selection process, how would you be able to discern how that person might behave in that position as you're making your choice?
It's a great question. You're not going to be able to weed everybody out, right? It's not going to be possible. But what you can do is take a look at the person's career. So when you have attorneys that have argued on both plaintiff and defendant side, or prosecutor and defendant side, then when you see them on both sides, they get to see what both sides works like. They've argued both sides of the case. That goes a long way for judges to become unbiased, right? I think that if you have somebody has only litigated on one thing and like has only been a prosecutor their entire lives, I'm not saying not going to be a good judge, but there has to be something more. I need to see a little bit more. Maybe my conversations with that person, maybe I get some feel from them saying, okay, they can discern that decision despite their long career in the prosecutor's office. But I would like to see more of the nominees or the applicants to be people who have been on both sides of all these issues.
Very interesting. I have another question for you about the Governor's Council. So we know that judge selection is a key part of what Governor's Council does. What are some of the other functions of Governor's Council so that our viewers are informed? You talked about pardons a few minutes ago, but what are the other things that Governor's Council are charged with?
Well, some
Council,
of
I'm
the
sorry,
other ones,
charged with.
some of the other ones
Sorry.
is confirming, clerks, parole board people. There's a whole host of positions. Would take a long time to name them all. But like you say, clemencies, pardons, things like that. They also oversee notary public, and then they vote on treasury warrants, which is not really exciting at all. But I think the one that probably is the next most exciting is the clemency part of it.
So talk to me a little bit about that function and how your decision-making process under those circumstances would most likely line out.
So with clemency, again, pardons, clemency, anything like that, it's always going to be a case by case. But just like with judges, there's got to be factors, right? So the first factor is the severity of the crime. You're probably not going to be pardoning somebody who's a mass murderer, right? Like it's simple. The next part I think is really paying attention to the victims, right? Somebody who lost a child, I'm a father of three. That's going to be tough for them if that person gets a pardon. And I think that's something that you really have to really pay attention to the impact on the victims. The other thing that I would really look at is how long has it been since when it happened to now? What steps has that person taken to make amends for his or her mistakes? And are they actually sorry? And those are the key factors. But it's a case by case, and it's a long process. But I think those are the things. Like not everybody's going to get a pardon. That's just not how it's going to work.
Flipping, I mean, very similar, but like looking toward parole board, similar criteria. What are
No,
your thoughts
actually,
around that, or
I
different?
I think the difference with parole board, right? So with the parole board, I think you're looking more for a social workers background versus a legal background, right? So for judges, I really want to see obviously attorneys and people have a legal background who have been in both sides of the cases. I would
Mhm.
much rather see the parole board have a more social workers to understand what these people have gone through, what their background is, and then you can tell if the person's actually made amends or you think that this person is a good fit for being a pro bono. I'm not saying attorneys can't be on it, but I really think social workers are better suited for that position.
Interesting. Well, thank you for filling in a little bit more of the duties around Governor's Council. I think that folks do focus in a lot on the judge selection piece, and a
Right.
lot of voters don't understand. Like, there's a lot that Governor's Council does, and so that's very, very helpful for folks to understand. So pulling back from Governor's Council itself a little bit, I want to focus back in on you, Mr. Murphy. So what makes you uniquely qualified in your background, in your opinion, to serve on Governor's Council? We talked a little bit about your background at the top of the show, but I'd like to hear more about that.
So, when you were appointing this position for judges, you want well-rounded people. I think my background, I come from a pretty diverse, well-rounded background. Like I said, I worked in blue collar most of my life. I'm a vet. I know what it's like to transition from the military to civilian world. I understand what it's like to raise a family on a blue collar income or a middle class income. And your viewers might be surprised to know that not all attorneys make millions and millions of dollars. I don't. We do a lot of pro bono work. Like I said, my first child's going off to college, and the bill for that was shocking. And I have two more that are going to be going, they're 4 years apart. So I got 12 years of college to pay. And I'm also an attorney and litigator. I've been in court a lot. So I see how the courtroom works. I understand. I have the connections with my other colleagues to make phone calls and say, hey, tell me about this individual. Do you think they're a good fit? And things like that. So I think that that's the well-roundedness is what makes me a good candidate for the governor's council.
If I'm just curious to find out as you've been, and I shouldn't quiz you on how many cities and towns are in District 2. I will just say that there are a lot.
37.
37. So, just in the interest of fairness, I did ask the other candidates that, so I didn't want to ask you. But I'm just curious, Mr. Murphy, as you're going through and campaigning in these cities and towns, what are some of the issues that you're hearing as you're on the campaign trail about governor's council candidates and some of the things that folks have asking you questions about, and maybe some issues that you'd like to maybe talk a little bit further on?
Well, first, as I'm campaigning, I'm realizing that nobody even knows this position exists most of the time, and then
Fair.
very few actually have an interest in it. It's not as glamorous as being a rep or a senator or any of those things. But a lot of people, once you get past that, they want to talk about like the questions you asked. What makes a good judge? What's a good candidate? What's the process? And I think I've answered some of those questions. But
Mhm.
most of the time when you're campaigning, people really want to know about you. Who are you and where you come from? And I think that's people vote for people they like tend to be. And so I think that that's really the most questions I get. As far as the technical questions about the governor's council, I haven't gotten many.
Okay, well, I'm not going to get too technical. I don't think we've gotten too technical with our
No.
discussion, and that's not the intent of the interview. It's more or less to let folks know who you are and why you're running. So that's fascinating. One thing that folks in Ashland have actually asked me about governor's council and different governor's council candidates is, you know, how long do you think is appropriate for governor's counselors, pardon me, to serve?
Well, it's an elected position, so it's every
Yeah,
2 years up for reelection.
right.
How long? That's a tough question to answer.
Yeah.
Um, for that in fact, I haven't even gotten there yet, so I don't know. But I think some of the more senior people on the council, like Terry Kennedy, like I said, I go back to Terry Kennedy because I know him. He's been on there a long time, but he does a good job. So if it's not broken, don't fix it, kind of thing. We don't have term limits here in
Mhm.
Massachusetts, and for
Mhm.
good reason. I think our voting population is educated, smart, and tuned in. So if somebody's not doing their job, then they're not going to get sent back in.
I think you'll get everywhere with complimenting voters like that, Mr. Murphy. but there are a vocal group of folks who, I think every election cycle we hear more about term limits. But it sounds like from your position, there, you have to kind of balance like any other term limit, any other office really here in the Commonwealth. You have to balance. Okay, well, experience enables one to do the job
Correct.
effectively, right? But sometimes folks linger in their positions because people, especially with offices like governor's council, people just sort of fill in the dot, or however folks are voting. And actually, we fill in the dot, fill in the dot without thinking about it. So, you know, I guess as folks are making their decisions and about who they should select, and hopefully they've been following our series here on WACA. We've had the opportunity to interview, I think, all of the candidates at this point. What should, in your opinion, people keep in mind when they're making that selection?
I think they should keep in mind, what the position is. First, look what we're doing. The biggest thing we're trying to do is get good judges, and keep in mind what the candidates are saying about how they're going to do that. right?
Okay.
Like I said, I have experience that is as an attorney, but I also have experience not as attorney, and well-rounded background. Like, and to plug myself again, is I think is essential for this. If you've been in one career your entire life, you may not understand what it's like to be someone coming home from work after an 18-hour day, or struggling, or it's losing your house, or things like that. And I think that's important to understand those things in this position.
We are coming up on the end of our time, Mr. Murphy. So, I know you're like, oh, I'm going to plug myself again. I'm going to ask you to plug yourself again to make your final or your closing arguments about why you feel that you are the most qualified person for this position in District 2. And then we'll ask a little bit more about contact information and how people can get in touch with the campaign.
Sure. My name is Sean Murphy. I'm a candidate for Governor's Council. I'm a veteran. I'm a father of three, former union member, and I'm an attorney. And I really hope that you'll come out on September 3rd and vote for me, because I just want to make sure we have good, qualified, and unbiased judges.
Mr. Murphy, how can people get in touch with your campaign?
Well, they can go to our website, which is www.electseanmurphy.com, and all our contact information is there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being on the Views Expressed. Really appreciate you coming to participate in our Governor's Council forum, as it were. And I thank the viewers of Ashland for taking the time to learn more about this important office and to learn more about our candidates. Once again, Mr. Murphy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.